Alicia.
Good afternoon and welcome to this KPMG CNBC Africa special where we're broadcasting to you live from KPMG's headquarters in Johannesburg this afternoon. I'm Alicia Seckham. Well, according to the UN, by 2030, Africa will have 760 million urban residents. By 2050, that figure is expected to grow to 1.2 billion. Now, this rapid migration has intensified the need for Africa to develop its infrastructure base and its megacities, and with that, we've had that infrastructure development program become one of the key priorities across the African continent. In this 9th episode of the KPMG Africa Conversation series, we'll be taking a closer look at prioritizing Africa's megacities. And to help me do just that, my esteemed panel of guests this afternoon are Sue Bannister, who's a partner at City Insights, and Dile Skosana, who's Associate Director of Infrastructure at KPMG Infrastructure Government Advisory Services, and then Debase Scott as well, who's the Head of Infrastructure Africa at KPMG. Welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Well, Sue, let's start off with you. I came across the quote, the world today is more about cities than it is about countries. That's according to A.T. Kearney in the 2012 Global Cities Index. To what extent do you agree?
I completely agree. I think cities really are where it's happening these days. I think research has shown that cities make people smarter, cities make people more creative. Cities are where it's easiest to provide infrastructure, and I think cities really are where, if countries are made or broken, that's where it'll be.
It seems almost hard to believe, though, Debase, because when it comes to the African continent, and specifically with foreign investors seemingly only now making the distinction between the various countries, on the continent, let alone the cities within those countries, or is that just the perception and something that we're historically having to deal with?
I think, Alicia, it's if I can just take the opportunity to just put a bit of perspective on it. I mean, you started explaining to us what the population issue is all about. That 1.2 billion people you're talking about is going to represent around about 60% plus of the total population on the continent of people that will live in a city. There's already more than 50% right now. Now, if we think about that, that the total livable area of cities is a mere 2% of the total livable space of of where people can live on the planet. It's beginning to highlight to us what is the extent of the urgency of what we're dealing with here. We can't just ignore it and start thinking about a city is just another infrastructure project in isolation. These things need to be thought about completely differently, and that is what I believe the investors are also looking for. It's a more holistic, consolidated approach.
When it comes to the strict definition of what constitutes a megacity, though, it's very interesting, Andile, because it's a megacity is made up of an area that houses more than 10 million people. That's a pretty strict definition that we're looking at there.
It is. And it's part of the debate around what makes a megacity. With 10 million people in a tight area, I think cities are becoming much more complex to manage as well. I agree completely with the sentiment that they're becoming as prominent and even superseding countries, and the systems to manage it are arguably not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Not there yet, but inroads being made. Before we get into this discussion even further, Andile, I was perusing your biography, and you're described as an urban enthusiast. What gets you excited?
Lots excites me about the city. It's the energy. It's the people that are together, and it's people who are now finding themselves in very close proximity and beginning to conflict a little bit, rub up against each other in different ways, and learn a lot more from each other. Much as we're getting smarter, we're also changing very fast, and I think that's very important and interesting and exciting for our African identity.
So with that being the case then, I mean, do we look at the strict numbers and what constitutes a city in that means, or do we look at the tone of an environment more so?
I think it's much more about the tone. I mean, just on the numbers, the other issue is that in many cities we don't know how many people live there. The enumeration of people in shack settlements is enormously difficult, and many cities don't consist of just the city itself, but of a kind of a hinterland of people who've also come to try and get into the city. So although the administrative boundaries may say we have 5 million people, there are many, many more. And more people are arriving in cities all the time.
Okay, so let's get the perspective on African cities debates, because with over half the world's population being urban dwellers at this stage and generating in some cases up to 80% of the country's national production and income, where do African cities stand in that regard in terms of urban development and how it's actually contributing to national GDP levels right now?
Well, that's a very good question. I think just before I try and answer that one, I would just like to add on to the point made by Sue right now, that recently at the World Economic Forum, a study was released that said there's going to be over 1,000 new cities built on the continent by 2050. Now that's a staggering number if you think about it. There are merely 3 megacities at this point of time. That's expected to also change quite substantially. So,
and Johannesburg, not one of those 3.
Yeah, that begs the question exactly: how do you define Johannesburg? I mean, Johannesburg has got, I'm pretty sure it's got more than one definition. But it's, I mean, as far as the question of the investment is concerned, this is just. I think, investment follows the people. People follows the, invariably the money, and where the possibility of money is. If you look at the history of Africa, the extent of urbanization, people follows work and jobs, etc., and that's where the investor money is going to go as well. And there's lots of evidence of that happening on the continent.
If you're looking at the gaps that need to be filled, again, Andile, I'm going to pose the question to you in terms of urban development and how it's contributing to economic growth in Africa right now. I mean, how far away are we from reaching our true potential?
I'm an optimist about African cities. I think we have a great opportunity because most African cities, we've got infrastructure, it's old, but we have the opportunity to leapfrog. We have the opportunity to do things a little bit differently. If you use the standard measure by developed countries, we're far. But we can do different things.
We can do different things. There's still a significant gap, though, that needs to be filled, Sue. To what extent is this, the challenge that's facing urbanization right now to do with the lack of infrastructure and support in that regard coming through?
I think maybe I'm a little bit less of an optimist than Andile, but I think the gap is huge. I mean, there are probably 80% of people living in cities have some access to water, but I think the statistics show that less than 40% have access to sewerage. And those kind of things cause huge health-related problems. They mean that people are not as productive as they could be, and they also mean that businesses can't function as well as they should be. So we found that enormous amount of businesses are citing problems of just lack of road infrastructure and transport infrastructure in allowing them to function properly. So really, if we improve that infrastructure in cities, we'll be improving the working environment for businesses.
So Andile, back to you, the optimist then. I mean, is this enough now for us to start focusing on urban planning a little bit more seriously? Because when it comes to highlighting some of the challenges around setting infrastructure and public works up, transportation ranks amongst the lot as well. Broadly speaking, first, has it been a case of underestimating what we needed to be supportive of our growth in the first place?
I don't think we underestimated it. I have to agree. I agree with Sue. The challenges are big, but my optimism comes in that we can develop systems that work a little bit better than in other cities. And at this point where we are now, the opportunity in urban planning is to do stuff that is much more that is very different from what we're doing now. Basically making the systems work better. African cities have a history where I don't think they were sufficiently capacitated to begin with. It's not that we underestimated the challenge, but it's a moving target that we're really chasing. There's an influx of people who are coming in at a rate far exceeding what we can provide infrastructure at.
So we've been speaking very broad strokes then. What is step one here? I mean, where do you begin to start to be supportive of this, what's being called the largest migration in history, Debase?
Well, I think we need again to go back to the numbers. I think we're going through a phase where we can see more plans, quantified infrastructure development plans than ever before. PIDA has got a $360 billion plan. The SADC master plan is over $500 billion plan. Our own national development plan for the next 3 years is around about 850 billion rand. So on the short term, all of these plans, if you cut them up in the short term, is somewhere between about $65 billion to $90 billion per one of these plans. And these plans have got a little bit of overlap, but they are all separate on the end. So plans are there are actions around, people are thinking about these things, and I think it's a good start. I mean, nothing is going to happen if there's not a proper thought through plan and a proper thought through feasibility process that really underpins all of this. And then from there you need to go into a proper master plan per city, and then from that master plan some form of prioritization process needs to take place. These kind of monies are not on the continent, it's as simple as that. So unless there is a real think as to how do we split up the cake with what we've got and make sure there's the degree of prioritization, it's just going to, Africa is just going to remain the way it is.
So there's no disputing the fact that we've got blueprints out there, plenty of blueprints sitting on tables. So what are the biggest challenges to effective implementation?
I think the challenge is the capacity of local government staff and management to really put those plans into place. I just think that for me, you can have these fantastic plans, but unless you've got people in cities who are sufficiently professionally trained, but also trained in being able to manage processes and people and how the city develops, that we'll never really get there. So we can develop the infrastructure, but we also need to be able to collect the monies and manage our staff and make sure that the staff are doing what we need them to do. So I think we really need to start with, maybe not start, but go alongside the infrastructure development with the skills of local government officials.
Let's draw on the cities that have managed to get the ball rolling on this one. I mean, you focused on the delivery of basic services and related infrastructure across 60 of Africa's main cities. Which stands out for you as a solid case study at this point?
I think, and sorry to sound kind of house proud, but I think South Africa has done an amazing job. If you look in the years since, in the last 10 or 15 years, South Africa has done an amazing job in terms of just delivering basic services to people. From coming from a very low base, we've now got one of the highest levels of service delivery on the continent.
How much reliance comes through on policy and regulatory frameworks to actually achieving that kind of stride?
I think to make the example of informal settlements, we started with about 300 informal settlements in 1994. There's about 2,700 in 2011. That's just a South African context. But the housing backlog has almost stayed the same, and we've already delivered in the region of about 2.5 million houses already. So basically we're running to stand still, and in the good work that we've done, it doesn't reduce the backlog as yet. So we are chasing a moving target in many of these cities, and that is not to be underestimated.
I think if I can add on to what Andile just said, it's the reliance on established regulatory and financial frameworks is absolutely of paramount importance. Nobody wants to invest in basically anything and be the first one, and that's one of Africa's biggest problems, is that it lacks a track record in having done these particular projects, in particular PPPs and that kind of projects. There's literally a handful of examples of PPPs on the continent, and it's the kind of sort of complex project that is not going to take place unless new investors can see, but here is an example of an existing project that was successfully implemented. Its rights and legal profiles are being respected by the authorities. It's one of the problems, one of the biggest problems on the continent is this lack of it's really lack of track record, if you can call it like that.
Yeah. Talk us through some of the challenges, Andile, because you've led and participated in establishing conceptualizing as well the Gauteng Integrated Development Plan and the Human Settlement Strategy as well. So talk us through how exactly that was established and the effectiveness of that at the end of the day.
Well, the biggest challenge that we have in institutions is data. Knowing what to plan for and how much of it do we need, and whether the numbers are going up or going down. But in organizations, I would say once the plans are there, and arguably there's quite a lot of plans, we've done a lot of planning, there's not enough people to be able to convert that into something that is on the ground, to take the money, spend the money appropriately, get the deliverables and get the outcomes that are required to make our cities work a little bit better.
Yeah, your response to that kind of environment is setting up megacities in the face of those challenges, but then also in the face of acknowledging the fact that we have had quite a few success stories to boast about.
I think there have been many success stories, not just in South Africa, but in other countries too. And possibly one of the best ways we could have of improving development is learning from each other's success stories. In many cases, our lessons have come from the UK, the States, developed countries like Australia. But I think there's a lot to be said from Africa learning from other African countries, because we share many of the same problems, and we have an understanding of the same kind of issues. So I think that would be a great place to start, just a learning platform where we can learn from one another's mistakes and successes.
If we draw on some of the examples from South Africa, I mean, we've here seen an attempt to tackle the informal settlement situation and developments on that end, but we've also seen just how an inappropriate action can lead to dislocation, very extreme dislocation that can see the formation of slum dwellings as well. So there's got to be a very systematic approach here, and I think that at this point that needs to be emphasized.
Exactly, and I think that there's no silver bullet that's going to get us there. It's about taking small steps and trying to do the right thing on a consistent basis with the correct people and the correct skills. But I think a very important aspect of it is also working with people on the ground. I think we've come into a new area where governments can no longer afford to just do their thing and think they know best. Governments have now got to respond to the needs of people on the ground. If you look at many of the service delivery protests in South Africa, they say listen, and many of the protests throughout the world, if you look at what's happening in Cairo, a lot of that is people who are very unhappy about their living environment and the city that they're living in.
Because we've got to take a look at quite a wide spectrum of issues here. I mean, we've highlighted, sanitation, electricity, water supply, transportation even, but you've also got to cater to basic social needs like education, like healthcare, where data and gathering of that data and numbers is such a hindrance and a problem to providing these services. And I mean, how are governments starting to get their acts together in terms of determining what market they're catering to? Because we've identified the problem, it's time to start putting solutions on the table here.
Well, if I may go back to the small successes, because that's the reason for my enthusiasm actually about African cities, is that people, there's a turn in the past few years where the officials who are running the systems are willing to try out new things, and they are not at a large scale where we are able to build big partnerships and relationships, but it's small incremental processes. People are willing to explore a little bit with public participation, explore with different methodologies and new typologies, and a lot of that is actually happening on the ground. It doesn't yet materialize into projects and products that we can sell and cut ribbons from, but it's there.
We've got to acknowledge that it comes with a price tag as well, a pretty hefty price tag debate. How accessible is capital and funding to actually get these projects sustainably off the ground?
Well, it's always a challenge. I think it's people don't want to put their money where they don't have a degree of comfort where the money is going to. Many countries on the continent have done unsolicited bids as their almost the entire source of their infrastructure development. I mean, if you can't assess your risk profiles and there's not a degree of trust in those risk profiles, then you're simply not going to invest that. I think another point that's very important to make is that the perceived risk profiles of the African continent is extremely negative. It's a very different story on the ground. You know, it's important to go to the specific areas, to the specific cities, and understand how do they manage these risks themselves. And that's a very different risk profile than often what is perceived.
Yeah, you know, having said that, Sue, I mean, where risk profiles are prominent, it stresses the importance of needing to draw up effective budgets as well. I mean, how difficult a feat is that right now, given what Andile said about the fact that it's hard to collate the data in the first place, because one would assume you need that first of all to know what you need, what you're catering to, in order to be able to draw up budgets.
Yeah, I think the key to that is flexibility. So developing 10-year, 20-year plans, but then as you proceed over time, developing 5-year plans, 1-year plans, and being able to change and be flexible within that so that you can respond to new challenges, drop plans if they are no longer relevant.
Okay, well, at this point of the conversation, we're crossing now to Lagos, Nigeria. We're joined at this point by Wale Shonibare. He's the MD of Investment Banking at UBA Capital, and he joins us live from UBA's trading floor. Thanks so much, Wale, for taking the time to join our conversation this afternoon. Of course, one of the cities, megacities that the African continent boasts is that of Lagos. So talk us through some of the developments that are unfolding on your end, and just how Lagos and the city of, Nigeria as a whole has managed to effectively get the ball rolling on this one.
Yeah, well, if I've heard you correctly, you want to have an update on what's been going on in Lagos, in Nigeria in general, in terms of infrastructure development. Is that correct?
Yes, Wale, we seem to be having a problem with sound from your end, but just looking at, the kind of city developments that have taken place over in Lagos, a specific focus on Eco-Atlantic. I mean, talk us through that success story and your view on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that with the very fast economic growth that we're seeing in Nigeria and Lagos as a whole, I mean, Lagos constitutes a significant percentage of the GDP growth, the contribution to GDP in Nigeria. There's a need to develop a business district, and Eco-Atlantic City is a typical example of a situation where two issues are being addressed at the same time. One is the erosion you're getting from the Atlantic, and the other is the need to create a very business-friendly environment. So it's a public-private partnership where the state has been very much involved in mobilizing, assisting the private sector investment to come in to develop that area. So the plans are very ambitious. It's something that's going to be developed, I think, over a period of about 20 years to reclaim the Atlantic and build a modern business-friendly environment.
Let's take a look at things in detail from a funding perspective here, Wale, because you've joined our conversation at that point where we're starting to address some of the funding issues that are associated with developing these megacities across the continent. You say that the government has come through with incentives for the private sector. What exactly are we looking at that's getting the private sector enticed?
Yeah, to get the private sector involved, you need to have the right regulatory environment. Government has to provide the right level of permits. There are environmental issues to be looked at, particularly in relation to developing a scheme like Eco-Atlantic City. People need to feel that the environment is secure, and the financial markets have to be able to support this level of infrastructure development. So we've seen local banks willing to participate in supporting the initiative.
Andile, for now we have most infrastructure projects on the continent domestically financed. It's via African taxpayers and consumers, but that's not proving to be a very sustainable model, is it?
And it needs developers that are of significant scale to be able to mobilize the level of capital that you need for investments of this scale.
Exactly. So, Wale, let's hit pause on the conversation from your end. I mean, this is the disadvantage.
That's allowing them to be able to do different rounds of fundraising to support the investment.
Wale, let's hit pause on the conversation with you at this point. This is the advantage of having one of our guests so far away. And I think we seem to be having some technical difficulties with that line as well and communicating to you this afternoon. And Dile, I'd like to bring it back to you and again, go back to this question about African taxpayers and consumers actually funding this. This is not proving to be a very sustainable model. Are PPPs the only viable solution here?
PPPs are not the only viable solutions, but I'd like to pick on just two aspects of the problem. The first one is the way that cities put out some of the projects and the needs that they have in the cities. Government cannot do it alone. And there's good examples in Lagos itself, as well as in Nairobi, in Joburg as well, where you've got the city admitting that it can't do everything, and therefore there are other players that it needs to invite. And African cities need to learn to do that better. And the second part of it is that African consumers are not yet wealthy enough, and there is an opportunity. Well, it is projected that there's going to be increasing discretionary spend. I think it's the Development Bank that is projected that there will be African consumers are getting wealthier slowly but surely, and by the time we are getting to 2025, 2050, we will have much more of a privately driven consumption by African consumers who can drive now the economies. Yeah. But at the moment, we're not there yet.
Sue, when it comes to the PPP model, I mean, when it comes to buy-in specifically, just how tough a sell is it in terms of getting business to work hand in hand with government on projects like these? Because, of course, the big elephant in the room is always the issue around trust.
I think not just on PPPs, but on many projects that I think it's incredibly difficult for the private sector. It's also difficult for government. We've got a strange set, I think, of legislation that forces us to walk along a very narrow line that is often not to the benefit of broader society nor to government or business. But it's what we've got to try and keep government and business in line. But it makes for a very difficult working environment. I think one of the problems that the private sector face are their counterparts within government need to be able to work with them and make the project happen. It's not like the private sector can just do the project and then hand it over on at the end and think that local government or government will be able to make it happen. They just aren't the skills.
Debase, also what crops to mind immediately is one would assume that there's got to be some kind of mechanism put in place to address wastage specifically, where investing funds without tackling inefficiencies would basically be like pouring money into a leaking bucket. And that's what investors want to hear. They want to hear that there's enough security, and that would serve as a signal to investors, one assumes, that Africa is in fact open for business and lessen that risk profile that you were highlighting a little earlier.
Yeah, I think it's a case of small steps. We're talking about PPPs here. I think PPPs brings a couple of advantages. I mean, if we just look at it quickly, it brings a very well-defined risk-sharing process, much better than any other process. It brings in private capacity, which simply does not exist in the cities as it is, and it spreads the available pot of affordability. You can just do so much more. So. I mean, if we talk about PPPs, that's a good starting point of how to go about it. Having said that, it's not always the answer to have a PPP, but if you can apply those principles, because it's got a lot of well thought through principles that can be applicable in virtually any project, and we can do much worse than to think about every project as if it could be a PPP, even if it turns out not to be one.
Yep. Wale, before we let you go for this segment of the show, I mean, I want to throw the focus on developmental finance specifically. What role does developmental finance have to play in this entire equation in your books?
Sorry, could you just come again with that question?
Developmental finance, what role do you see it playing in the development of megacities on the African continent and setting up effective infrastructure bases?
Yeah, well, development finance always has a critical role to play because it's difficult to mobilize long-term funding in emerging markets, so you always require the development finance institutions to come in and provide relatively low-cost financing over long-term, you know, say up to 15 years, that always makes it easier to fund projects, particularly things like power, where you have to, you know, you have tariffs which need to be affordable. So it's important that you can get very cheap long-term funding for those kinds of projects.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Wale, we're going to have to leave the conversation there with you for this afternoon. Thanks to you for joining us. Wale Shonibare is the MD of Investment Banking at UBA Capital. He joined us live from UBA's trading floor in Lagos, Nigeria. And just to end off this section of the show, to quote Jeffrey West, cities are the cause of the good life. They are the centers of wealth, creation, creativity, innovation and invention. They're exciting places, and they act as magnets that suck people in. We're back straight after this, so don't go away.